A boy stares up at the sky. His fingers cling to a rusting fence as he counts 1, 2, 3 silver dots against the clouds. Not birds, not angels, machines. And they're not here to visit. It's July 1940. Britain doesn't feel like an empire anymore. It feels like an island waiting to drown. And here's the question, the one Winston Churchill would never ask out loud. Can 100 boys with barely enough fuel for half an hour stop the greatest air force the world has ever seen? Pause. Deep breath. Because that's exactly what they were asked to do. They called it the Battle of Britain, but to those who lived it, it wasn't a battle. It was a siege in the sky. A siege where surrender meant extinction. Just weeks before, the French army had collapsed in 6. Belgium, gone. Holland, gone. Poland, a memory. Hitler's Wehrmacht had carved a path of iron from Warsaw to the Channel. And now, all that stood between him and the British coastline was a 22-mile stretch of ocean and a handful of Hurricanes and Spitfires. You could call them pilots or gamblers with wings, but make no mistake, if they lost, the invasion would come. Hitler's Operation Sea Lion was ready. The landing boats were assembled, maps printed, orders signed. All they needed was one thing: control of the skies. That's the real story, not just dogfights or aircraft specs, but the invisible line between survival and silence, drawn not on land or sea, but 20,000 feet above. You know Churchill's famous line, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Powerful, right? If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps us bring more forgotten stories like this to life. But what most people forget is when he said it. August 20th. At that moment, no one knew if those few would still be alive by September. Imagine waking up every morning knowing your nation's future rests on teenagers, some barely out of school, facing trained killers flying Messerschmitts. And now imagine you're one of them. Your squadron lost 2 yesterday. The airfield was hit last night. Fuel is rationed. You haven't slept. And now the scramble siren wails again. You run. You don't think. Because in 60 seconds, you'll be climbing into a cockpit, and in 3 minutes, someone will try to kill you with cannon fire. Ever tried focusing on a target while your canopy shakes from machine gun bursts? That was breakfast for these men. Let me tell you about Peter, a 19-year-old from Yorkshire. First mission, he vomited in his oxygen mask. Second mission, he shot down a Heinkel. Third mission, he never came back. Do you remember what you were doing at 19? And now this guy is full of thunder, not from clouds, from engines. From 1,000 wings made of aluminum and ambition. From 100 hearts beating fast behind steel dashboards, knowing the margin of error is death. But here's the twist. It wasn't just courage. It was strategy. It was coordination. It was chess played at supersonic speeds, with humans as pawns and time as the enemy. Because while the Luftwaffe sent waves, Britain responded with brains. Not brute force, not numbers, but something else. A ghost in the radar. A voice in the headset. A net of vision that the Germans didn't know existed. So I ask again, can a handful of men truly hold off an empire by sheer will at 20,000 feet? The answer is coming. But you might not like how close we came to losing, because what happens next isn't about glory. It's about choices, cost, and ghosts that still fly. And now, before the sun sets on this memory, let's meet the men who flew into it. The underdogs in the cockpit, The next chapter begins in the mind of a 17-year-old who lied about his age just to face death in the sky. The letter was short. Report to RAF Uxbridge. Bring only what you can carry. Tommy Reed had just turned 18. His hands still bore the calluses of factory work. He'd never been in a plane, but here he was, boarding a train with nothing but a duffel bag, a uniform that didn't quite fit, and a photo of his sister tucked inside his chest pocket. What kind of man volunteers to fight a war 3 miles above the ground? Better question, what kind of empire asks them to? Pause. Let's talk about the pilots, the few, but not just the British few. They came from New Zealand, Canada, Australia, from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, especially from Poland. Some escaped occupied France. Others fled across oceans and continents just to be handed an RAF flight manual and told, "This is your war now." And many of them barely spoke English. That's not poetic. That's historical record. Imagine coordinating a dogfight with seconds to live and your wingman doesn't understand your words. But here's the secret history. They didn't need words. They flew with fury, because most of them had already lost everything. Jan Zumbach, Polish ace, had seen his homeland crushed beneath tank treads. Josef Františko, Czech, had flown for 3 different countries before finding a cockpit that would accept him. These weren't just pilots, they were men with no more land to defend. So they defended the sky. Pause. That brings us to a decision, one that still sparks debate among historians. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding. A name you probably don't know, but should. He ran Fighter Command. He built it, in fact. And when Churchill wanted all pilots in the air, throwing everything they had at the incoming swarms, Dowding refused. He kept squadrons in reserve. It made no sense to politicians, but to Dowding, it was the only chance to survive the long war. He believed battles weren't won in waves. They were won in rhythms, one punch at a time. And that made him enemies, even within his own government. Churchill wanted fire. Dowding gave him patience. What would you have done? Thrown every plane into the storm, or trusted the silence between attacks? Because in war, the difference between heroism and stupidity is usually written in blood. Let's not forget what these pilots were facing. Their average age is 20. Their life expectancy? 3 weeks. And yet they flew, sometimes twice a day, often from grass fields littered with wreckage and fuel tanks half full. And when they weren't in the sky, they slept in hangars, played cards with trembling hands, drank cheap tea, and laughed louder than they should, not because they were happy, but because it drowned the hum of approaching engines. There's a letter found years later in an old flight log from a pilot named Alan Deere. He wrote, "I don't know if I'll see next week, but I feel more alive up there than anywhere else." That's not courage. That's surrender to purpose. So here's the question for you. Were these boys heroes, or were they the last currency of a dying empire, spent in the hope of buying just one more week of freedom? Because here's the paradox. They were trained by an empire that was fading, but in the sky, they became something timeless. Knights, if you will. Not in armor, but in aluminum. And while the history books remember them as the few, they weren't few in heart and certainly not in impact. But this isn't a story about medals. It's about ghosts in cockpits. Ghosts who flew because someone had to. And what they didn't know, what no one outside of Dowding's war room knew, was that the British weren't relying on valor. They had something else. Something the Germans never saw coming. Something invisible. And that changes everything. Because what if I told you the real war for this, guys, was won long before a single plane took off?
There's a sound you've never heard. It's not a siren. It's not a scream. It's the hum of a radar dish, turning slowly, slicing through the air with invisible fingers. August 1940, somewhere along the southern coast of England, a tall tower stands, surrounded by sheep fields. At its base, two women, in headphones, scribble on notepads. One says, "Inbound, 30 plus, altitude 15,000. They don't panic. They pick up the phone. Miles away, an airfield comes to life. Engines roar, boots slam, pilots sprint, but the battle hasn't even begun. That's the point. This was Britain's secret weapon, and almost no one knew it. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a bomb. It was a network. Imagine a spider's web stretching from Scotland to Dover. Each node a radar station, each strand a communication line, and at the center, Fighter Command Headquarters, where every dot on a map was a potential death sentence or a victory. They called it Chain Home, but it wasn't just radar, it was a vision system. Think of it like this: while the Luftwaffe was throwing haymakers in the dark, the RAF saw the punches coming. Not seconds before, minutes. And when minutes decide life or death, that's not an advantage, that's a revolution. Let me explain. Dowding didn't just build radar stations, he built a system. An OODAA loop before the term existed. Observe. Radar and the Royal Observer Corps spotted incoming raids. Orient. Filter rooms triangulated position, altitude, strength. Decide. Sector controllers weighed which squadrons to deploy. Act. Ground control radioed pilots with exact vectors to intercept. This wasn't just command. It was orchestration. Imagine a chessboard, but instead of pieces, you have human lives, and the board moves every 10 seconds. Dowding wasn't moving units, he was moving moments, and each moment could save or cost. There's a famous story from Biggin Hill. An incoming raid was misreported as small. Only 3 Spitfires scrambled. Turns out it was over 60 bombers. But just as panic set in, the radar confirmed the size. Dowding's system adjusted. More planes launched in time. The airfield survived. Barely. What would have happened without radar? What would have happened if you had to guess? Because the Germans did guess. Their pilots flew blind. Their high command had no picture, no live updates, just smoke trails and static-filled radios. They thought they were winning. They thought the RAF was breaking. But Britain had eyes in the storm, and those eyes never blinked. Here's the irony. The Germans did know radar existed, but they underestimated it, dismissed it, even bombed it once, and then moved on. Why? Because it wasn't sexy. It wasn't a dogfight. It wasn't a victory photo. That history doesn't care about glamour. It cares about edges, and this edge made every RAF pilot not just a man in a machine, it made him part of something larger. Imagine you're a pilot now. Your engine growls as you climb through the clouds. You don't know where the enemy is. Then, a voice crackles through your headset. Bandits, 11 o'clock, 4 miles, angles 15. You turn. You trust. You engage, not because you see them, that because someone else did. So here's the question. What happens when one side sees the battle before it begins? What happens when the fog of war lifts for just long enough to make a difference?
Because that's what doubting gave Britain. Not hope, not bravado, but foresight. And in war, foresight is everything. But even with this invisible net, with this miracle of coordination and timing, there's one thing the system couldn't do. It couldn't make the decisions inside the cockpit. That's where we're going next, to the moment when the radar fades and instinct takes over. To the second when you must decide, pursue the enemy or protect your own. To the razor-thin edge where tactics, ego, and survival collide. What would you choose? Because the next chapter, it's not about systems. It's about seconds. You hear it before you see it. A scream across the sky. Not human, not machine. Something in between. It's the BF-109. Fast, vicious, predatory. And it's coming for you. Now. Your hands tighten on the stick. You push the throttle. The Spitfire lurches forward, agile like a hawk, but lighter. Your heartbeat? Out of sync with your training. You have 2 seconds, maybe 3. What do you do? Do you dive? Do you turn? Do you fight? This right here is the battlefield no general can command. It's not about orders. It's about reflex. And sometimes, ego. Let me tell you about Douglas Bader, a name etched into RAF legend. He lost both legs in a crash before the war. Doctors said he'd never fly again. He didn't listen. He strapped on 2 tin prosthetics and returned to the sky. Not as a passenger, as a squadron leader. Bader was brave, unquestionably, but also reckless. There's a moment in August 1941, yes, just after the Battle of Britain, when Bader broke formation to chase a German fighter. He got the kill, but then he was hit and captured. Some say his squadron took unnecessary risks trying to save him. Others say he inspired them all. So, was that courage? Or was that vanity? Because in the air, 1 second of pride can cost 6 lives. And yet, that same boldness often won the day. Here's the dilemma every pilot faced. Do you chase the kill or stay in formation? Do you protect your wingman or go for glory? The Luftwaffe had the edge in numbers. They flew in tighter packs, more disciplined. But they also had a weakness: fuel. Their BF-109s had limited range. They had 20 minutes to fight, and then they had to turn back or fall into the sea. The RAF knew this, so sometimes British pilots didn't even have to win. They just had to last. Stay alive long enough, and the Germans would leave. But tell that to a 19-year-old with a target in his sight. Tell him to wait. Tell him not to chase. Now you understand the tyranny of seconds. You're flying at 300 miles per hour. A Messerschmitt flashes past. Your finger tightens on the trigger. But wait. If you turn, you'll leave your squadron. If you climb, you might expose your belly. If you do nothing, he might shoot your friend. What do you choose? This wasn't a movie. There was no dramatic score, just engine noise, gunfire, and silence when it ended. There's a story, rarely told, about a pilot named George Unwin. They called him Grumpy, not because he was angry, but because he hated needless risk. During one sortie, he saw a fellow pilot break off to chase a straggler. Unwin could have followed. He didn't. He stayed in position. That decision saved his life and 4 others. Because moments later, a German ambush descended where the straggler had gone, and Grumpy's formation was there to respond. Sometimes restraint is the deadliest weapon. So, here's the paradox. Every dogfight was a dance between chaos and discipline, between adrenaline and calculation. And inside each cockpit, the pilot wasn't just flying. He was making moral choices. Do I kill? Do I flee? Do I protect? And in those decisions lay the fate of the entire island. Because if too many broke formation, if too many chased kills instead of survival, the system would collapse. But they didn't. They balanced instinct with duty. And somehow, despite the noise, the fear, the speed, they held. But there's something else. Something history almost forgot. Not all of Britain's best pilots were British. And the greatest squadron of the entire war, it spoke Polish. Are you ready to meet them?
The skies above England were crowded, but not with just British voices. Some squadrons spoke clipped English, others rolled their R's, snapped their consonants, or shouted warnings in a language the command tower couldn't even translate. But they flew anyway. And they didn't just fly. They hunted. In the chaos of war, names get erased. Let me give you one back. Squadron 303. The most effective unit in the entire Battle of Britain. Highest kill rate, fastest engagement times, lethal precision. And yet, for weeks, they weren't even allowed to fight. Why? Because they were Polish, because they were foreign, because in the eyes of the British Air Ministry, they weren't quite ours. Can you feel that? The absurdity? Imagine you've escaped a Nazi invasion. You've watched your country fall, your family disappear, your flag torn down. And now you're told, wait, observe. We'll call you if needed. But they didn't wait. They insisted. They trained, they begged, and finally, they were sent into the sky. Their first mission? They downed 6 German aircraft. No losses. The tower barely had time to record the victories. By the end of the Battle of Britain, Squadron 303 had destroyed more enemy planes than any other RAF unit. These were not just skilled pilots. They were men with vengeance in their loins. You want to understand fury? Talk to a man who has seen Warsaw burn. You want to understand focus? Watch a Czech pilot fly straight into machine gun fire, because the ruins of Prague still live in his dreams. These men weren't fueled by orders. They were fueled by memory. There's a report buried in an RAF archive describing how Czech ace Josef František broke formation repeatedly during patrols.
He disappeared from radar, then reappeared with a confirmed kill. The brass hated it, but the scoreboards didn't lie. František died in a crash. He wasn't in combat. He was returning from a mission. The engine failed. Some say he was exhausted. Others say he pushed too far. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. He fought as if he had nothing left to lose. Because he didn't. But here's the uncomfortable truth. After the battle ended, after the skies were quiet, and victory parades rolled through London, many of these foreign heroes were quietly sidelined. They weren't invited to peace talks. Some weren't even thanked. Britain, rebuilding its pride, turned inward. The narrative became, we stood alone. But that's not entirely true, is it? Because standing alone doesn't include Squadron 303, or the Czechs who flew like ghosts through clouds of flak, or the Canadians, the South Africans, the New Zealanders. So why were they left out? Was it politics? Was it pride? Or was it something darker? Because buried in the margins of war are the names that carried it. And if we forget them, what else have we already lost? Here's a paradox for you. The men who saved British skies weren't British. And yet their stories drifted like vapor trails, visible only if you knew where to look. But now we remember. Now we see. But the Luftwaffe, by this point, was starting to see something too. Not just planes, not just resistance, but something deeper. You can break a machine, you can break a plane, but breaking a pilot, that's slower, quieter, and far more permanent. In September 1940, Hermann Göring made a decision, a fatal one. He ordered the Luftwaffe to stop bombing RAF airfields. Instead, he turned toward the cities, London, Coventry, Liverpool. Why? Because he believed the RAF was broken, because he believed fear would finish what firepower had not, because, in his own words, the British are on their knees. But they weren't, and that miscalculation changed everything. You see, up until that point, RAF bases had been under relentless pressure. Hangars burned, runways cratered, ammunition ran low. Another week of that, and maybe the radar would have gone silent, the fighters grounded, the coast open. But Göring shifted targets and gave Britain room to breathe, a pause, just long enough for the RAF to regroup, just long enough for the system to reset, just long enough to survive. Irony sharp enough to cut steel, because by choosing to terrorize the cities, the Luftwaffe lost the skies. And once they lost the skies, they lost everything. Now, let's talk about the men in those cockpits. German pilots, elite, trained, fearless, but human. They were told this would be easy, that Britain would crumble like France. Instead, every mission got harder, every sortie more desperate, and every time they returned, more of their friends didn't. There's a diary found in a Luftwaffe barracks dated September 17th. It reads, "We no longer speak before missions. I stay on the floor.
We know the odds. You don't need bombs to destroy an air force. You need doubt, and doubt had begun to fester because the Germans couldn't understand why the British kept coming. They believed they were winning. Their radio intercepts said so. Their command said so. But their experience said something else. Picture this. You're 21 years old. Your squadron leader was shot down yesterday. You're flying over Kent, the enemy's backyard. Fuel is low, your gun's jammed once already, and from the clouds, 3 Spitfires dive at you like shadows with teeth. You turn, you dive, you survive, this time. But something breaks inside you, and the next morning, you hesitate. Just a second. Just long enough. That's how morale collapses. Not in screams, but in silence. Goering, desperate to regain control, made another mistake. He'd promised his pilots rest, rotations, better equipment. He delivered none. Instead, more pressure, more lies, more deaths. And the Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, began to fracture. Here's what no one saw at the time. The Germans weren't just losing planes. They were losing trust in their leaders, in their mission, in themselves. And war at its core is still a human endeavor. Machines fall, but when men fall, they don't rise again. So ask yourself this: how do you lose a war you thought you were winning? Answer: slowly, then all at once. By October, the raids lessened. By November, they ceased. And though the war continued, the Battle of Britain was over. But the cost? Still rising. And that brings us to the final reckoning. The price, the silence, the memory that still echoes whenever a jet crosses the English sky.
It was a quiet morning. Too quiet, some would say. The kind that carries the weight of what's missing. The hum of engines, gone. The craters in the fields, still there. But the skies, clear. Pause. The Battle of Britain had ended. No parade, no trumpet, just survival. But at what cost? Over 500 RAF pilots died during those desperate months. Many were buried with no names on their headstones. Their average age? 20. Let that settle. Not old enough to rent a car today, but old enough to be the last line of defense for an entire civilization. That's not hyperbole. That's history. Pause. Britain didn't win because it was stronger, or richer, or bigger. It won because it didn't stop. Because a few hundred men refused to let go of the sky. Because of radar stations powered by cold hands and stubborn wires. Because of voices over headsets that cracked, not from static, but from fear. And because of people like you watching this now, who still care enough to remember. But here's the twist. The Battle of Britain didn't end the war. It just made sure there was still a war to fight. Without that victory, there's no Normandy, no D-Day, no liberation of Paris. There's just silence and the slow march of tyranny. Pause. Every modern air defense system, from missiles in Ukraine to drones in the Middle East, owes something to the doubting system. Every radar pulse, an echo of chain home. Every decision made from a command center, a descendant of a room where women in headphones pointed at dots on maps. History isn't just remembered, it reverberates. But perhaps the most haunting echo
is what could have happened if just one squadron had cracked, if one radar station had failed, if just 100 of them had missed their mark. What then? Would the swastika have flown over Buckingham Palace? Would Churchill have made his final broadcast from a submarine? Would this video, this memory, even exist? You'll never know. Because they didn't fail. But they could have. And that is the price of standing alone. But the real question, the one that's coming, is about another kind of siege. Not from the air, but from the ice, where a city bled for months, and winter was the deadliest weapon of all. Are you ready to face the cold truth of Stalingrad? Because the sky was brutal, but the ground was unforgiving.